facility-wide comprehensive approaches to preventing pressure ulcers. Today on the podcast. The Nursing Home Abuse Podcast is dedicated to providing news and information for families whose loved ones have been injured in a nursing home. Here are your hosts, Georgia attorneys Rob Schenk and Will Smith. Hey out there, welcome back to the podcast. As we produce this episode, we are in the middle of the pandemic, so we are not necessarily in our normal location, and Will and I are socially distancing ourselves from one another, and by that I mean he is at his home and I am at my home. So we're not able to do this together this particular time. We will remedy that in future episodes. Today we wanted to talk about pressure ulcer prevention in nursing homes and kind of what a comprehensive approach looks like. We're going to be talking about how an interdisciplinary team can work, how the frame of mind, how the nursing home itself from a 40,000 foot view, if they approach it in a certain way, how they can really reduce the instances of pressure ulcers. That is to say, if you look at everyone in your nursing home as a risk for pressure ulcers, then it's likely that you can put into place a simplified and standardized approach with everyone, and that can go a long way to preventing pressure ulcers, as opposed to having this person's low risk over here, this person's high risk over here, this type of thing, and you're making it uh, a little bit more difficult. I think our guests would say, to implement the appropriate interventions. And when I say guest, I mean Dr. Aletha Tippett. Dr. Aletha Tippett will be our guest today. Dr. Tippett received her BS in chemical engineering from the University of Missouri in 1975 and her MD from the University of Cincinnati in 1997. Dr. Tippett has done wound care for over 20 years and has treated over 15,000 wounds. Her main areas of focus in wound care are limb salvage and pressure ulcer prevention and treatment, and she brings a bioengineering approach to these, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in the episode. She's been honored with numerous awards in the healthcare community and is a published author and international speaker and teacher on wound care topics. Um, Dr. Tippett is also active in hospice and is a certified hospice medical director for Brookdale Hospice in Dayton, Ohio. And she recently published a book, Hear Our Cry, a story about 20 years of wounds and amputations. And she's the author, and we'll get into this a little bit later when we bring her on, of a paper called Reducing the Incidence of Pressure Ulcers in Nursing Home Residents, a prospective 6-year evaluation, which was super interesting. And with that, we're going to bring her on. Dr. Tippett, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Tippett, we wanted to have you on the show today. I guess first is by way of a background. I found a paper or a research document that you had done a few years ago about reducing the incidence of pressure ulcers in nursing homes, and that's kind of how I found you. And there was a lot of great information in that paper through your study that you had conducted. So that's kind of the genesis of why I wanted to have you on to just kind of talk about pressure ulcers in the nursing home setting, and what we can do from a facility-wide standpoint on preventing them in the residents. But before we delve into that, if you don't mind, can you just from a 40,000 foot view, can you explain what a pressure ulcer is?
Well, a lot of times people call them bed sores. Um, what it really is like your skin has had a stroke. Pressure, causes, if you have pressure on something, there's a lot of energy being exerted. And if you press on your skin over a bony prominence, which is going to be poking back up against that pressure, it takes about 20 minutes to create a sore. Okay, and some people call it bed sores, but it's more commonly called a pressure ulcer. The newest term is pressure injury, but we all know it as a pressure ulcer.
Sure.
But
And so
there's a lot of dynamics going on, but I like to think of it as your skin had a stroke.
I mean, I think that's, that's a good characterization of it. So I guess it goes without saying, and anybody that wants to learn a lot more about the definitions and the terms that Dr. Tippett had laid out, if you listen to episodes 121, 123, 135, and 138 of the podcast, we talk at length about what the difference is between those terms and maybe why we have those terms and things like that. But um, ideally for today, for the listener, Dr. Tippett and I are kind of go into a little bit more in depth on, obviously these are things that we want to avoid, but the point of
Oh,
it,
yes.
right. But the point is, what can the facility do to avoid them? And one of the things that attracted me to this paper that Dr. Tippett had done is the role of what's called the interdisciplinary team in the facility in helping to prevent them. So, Dr. Tippett, can you kind of walk us through what an interdisciplinary team is at a facility and what role they have in trying to prevent these injuries?
Sure. Um, the paper you're talking about was really a great job by that nursing home, and it was a big nursing home, 150 beds, but they went 6 years without getting a pressure ulcer, which is
Wow,
pretty good.
that's
Yeah,
very good.
yeah, that's kind of unheard of. But in general, let me tell you, nursing homes in general do a really good job. I mean, I've done wound care for 20 years and have done lots of legal cases where pressure injuries happen. And hands down, an injury occurs in the hospital. And then the nursing home gets it from the hospital. But nur- ulcers don't occur that frequently in a nursing home. Now, some do. Sometimes they do. In fact, that nursing home that you read the report on, before I started with them, they had about 25% of their patients had pressure ulcers that were caused from their facility. And we formed an interdisciplinary team, which is you have nurses, you have nutritionists, you have physical therapists, you have different disciplines all working together and with a commitment to not have any injuries. And within 4 months, they were at zero, and they stayed that way for 6 years that I was there with them.
So
And I don't know.
if I understand correctly, the interdisciplinary team is kind of like maybe what we would call the heads of the department. So like the Department of Nursing or the Director of Nursing, I should say the medical director, maybe the administrator or staff, they kind of form a committee or a team.
That that would be one. This was more hands-on people. These are the people that did the work. You had aides, you had nurses, you had physical therapists, you had dietitians, people that were actually doing the work as opposed to the nursing head or the administrative head. I mean, the administrative head joined us sometimes just so she could see what was going on,
Hmm,
but the people that did the work were the ones that were on the team.
I see.
And that, and part of it is you have to have a commitment. I mean, you could have a team, but if you didn't have the commitment, that team isn't going to do anything. But this group, their boss, their administrative boss said, we are going to do this. And they said, okay, and they did it. You know, the team all dived in and everyone, contributed their part to the program.
And so what does the team do? Like what are some of the interventions that they can put in place that would help prevent, and as you observed in this particular nursing home, eliminated
Well,
pressure
we
ulcers?
first of all decided what kind of pressure support. That's really important. Like you can't just be on a regular bed, okay? Now, none of the people in this nursing home could walk. They were all bed bound. And if you're bed bound, how are you going to relieve that pressure? You know, if you're laying on a hard bed, it's going to be really hard. You're going to have pressure points. So we looked at what support surface they were on, what kind of bed they were on, what kind of chair they were on. And I showed them that the beds that they were on were causing injury. I had pictures. I took pictures and showed them, and they said, whoa, okay. The next day, they changed and got different support surfaces. And that's what they had. They had new static air support surfaces on every bed and every chair. And they even had a person that went around making sure those were inflated right and were working properly. So that's part of what the team did was A, make sure we had the right support surfaces, and B, make sure that skin was lubricated. Dry skin is a no-no. I always teach dry skin is graffiti. If you go into an area, you see graffiti, you think this area isn't safe, right? So if you see dry skin, think this is not safe because if your skin is dry, it's more fragile. It can tear more easily. It can bruise more easily. It can be infected. It can get a pressure ulcer more easily. So if you lube them up, you help avoid pressure injury. And the right surface helps avoid pressure injury. And, part of the team's job was to make sure how do people maintain that every day? How do we make sure that we're doing this? And we appoint a wound champion, someone who knows a little bit about how wounds happen and who knows our program, and then tours and looks to see, oh, skin is not dry. They've all got the right pressure support surface on board and documentation is correct. They're writing the right things down. That's what the wound champion does, and they're part of that wound team.
That makes a lot of sense. So if I understand it correctly, it sounds like some of the more comprehensive steps taken by the facility, by the team, is you've got somebody making sure that the correct supportive support services are in place. So air mattresses, these type of things, proper cushions under the wheelchairs.
Correct.
You've got somebody looking out for dry skin, and then you've got
Correct.
you've got everybody being responsible for accurately documenting wounds or the development of fishy things on the skin. Not fishy being
Correct.
like fishy meaning suspect things on the skin. And then finally you have the wound or the skin champion that's kind of like not necessarily the supervisor, but somebody that holds the others accountable. But something that was really interesting that you talked about, and I want to make sure that our listeners are on board with this and understand this, is that while dry skin might be an indication of vulnerable skin,
Oh, you bet. Dry,
wet
dry skin is very,
right, but wet skin could be a risk factor for the development of pressure ulcers on particular parts of the body as well. So
actually, wet skin, it's not really pressure as much as it is dermatitis type of things,
I
not
see.
necessarily pressure. But so that's kind of a maybe not a misnomer, but a kind of a wrong idea that people have had all along. And when I say lube the skin, I mean it's not like just hand lotion. It's like we use bag balm, but that's not used in all nursing homes. Some won't use it, um, but you can use A&D ointment, something like that, a thick ointment, and you rub that all over the body, and that protects against moisture damage also.
Sure. See, yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that you're not talking about the skin needs to be moist, like with perspiration
No, no,
or fluids or
no,
anything like that.
no,
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so
no. The
wanted to
skin,
make that clear. But no, you're right. They draw the line. It's dry skin, okay, but really it's dermatitis that we're talking about. That's the skin can be, um,
um, if it's moist, if
yeah.
it's got too much moisture,
Hmm.
correct.
Okay.
Or it can be rubbed raw from just the moisture, you know. But no, and the lubrication I'm talking about is not something that makes your skin wet. In fact, it protects the skin against wetness
Wetness
and
and dryness. Yes.
and dryness. Yes,
That makes sense. In your paper, Dr. Tippett, you talk about the concept of simplification and standardization of pressure ulcer specific interventions. Can you kind of dive into that? What does that mean, and why is that a beneficial characteristic of a good system to prevent pressure ulcers?
well, and I've lectured on this recently. Said, you know, we know that this particular static air works. It works every time. I've used it for 20 years and it never doesn't work. And we use it in this nursing home that did 6 years. And so simplified is you don't have to worry about, well, gee, what's your Braden score? Are you high risk or low risk? Period. Everyone is high risk. And so you treat everyone. You don't have to worry about who needs it and who doesn't. You treat everyone. So simplification is if they come into our facility, we slap pressure ulcer prevention on them right away. We put them on the right support surface, bed and chair, and we lubricate their skin. And it doesn't matter who they are or what their risk factors are. Everyone's got the same. So that's simplification. And you don't worry about stratifying your risk. You just treat everyone the same. That's a simplified
Well, I think
way of
that we
looking at
have
it.
the answer of how that nursing home went to zero pressure ulcers then, because if you treat everyone as a high
We
risk for pressure ulcers and implement all of the interventions for someone who is at a high risk for pressure ulcers, then it's very likely that you're going to prevent them. And even if they do occur, then it's probable, if you're doing everything correctly and assessing everything correctly, that it was unavoidable due to the chronic illnesses of the individual anyway, right? Is that, I guess that's what I'm
correct,
hearing. Yeah.
and we catch it instantly and can correct it. Over the 6 years, they did have a couple early pressure ulcers, which we jumped right on and took care of. you know. But yeah, if you do that, if you simplify it to where you don't stratify your risk, everyone gets the treatment, you're going to be at zero, you know?
So do you, in terms of this particular nursing home seems to, in my experience would be not common, because it would appear to me that if you're treating everyone as a higher risk of anything, whether it be falls, pressure ulcers, UTIs, these type of things, it requires more training. It requires more interventions, which would be more money, more time. Have you seen that, or is there something that I'm not considering that might make it more fiscally beneficial to
Well,
expend this effort?
this this particular system that we adopted, training was minimal. You could teach an aide in 10 minutes. And they didn't need to know English. You could teach them. So it was very, very simple. And, you know, lubing the skin up, that takes what, 2 minutes to teach someone how to do that? And putting them on, if you automatically had the right support surface on, all you had to do was make sure it was there. It didn't take, it wasn't an extensive training required.
So I mean, and actually, that was going to be my next question. The the type of training, is this something that's like, did you develop after this study, or is this something that you've adopted from somewhere else? Where do the training
Oh,
materials come from?
we train as part of our program. I mean, I trained everybody on wound care. We had one session for everybody on wounds, how wounds happen, and what they are, and what you can do to prevent them. And then we, taught all the nurses, this is your support service, and here's how you make sure it's working right. And the aides were taught, here's how you lube the body up, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we just did that as part of our program.
So I guess if I'm here, because I mean, like there's in my experience, at least with how most nursing homes approach pressure ulcer prevention, you've got dietary, you've got nutrition intake. These are incontinent care. These are all factors that they nursing homes should keep in mind with regard to preventing these pressure ulcers or at least healing them. But it seems to me that you've really honed in that the primary drivers of prevention is the support surface and literally making sure the skin has you apply the
Proper
proper
protection.
protection to the
Correct.
skin. Um,
Really.
yeah.
I mean, I have to tell you, I mean, all the other stuff, the incontinence care and
Hmm.
the dietitian, those are those are all valuable, but they're not critical. The only things that really matter to prevent pressure injury are the two things I've mentioned.
I see. So, can you talk a little bit? And this might seem like a crazy segue, but this again, this was talked about in your research. But what is CMS, and what does CMS funding have to do with the prevention of pressure ulcers in facilities?
CMS is Medicare, and they don't pay you to prevent. If you get a pressure ulcer, they will not pay you to treat it.
Hmm.
So you really don't want to get an ulcer because they're not going to pay you.
You being
And
both the facility and the actual resident, definitely neither of those entities or parties want a pressure ulcer.
they're not. If you're in a facility and you develop an injury, a pressure ulcer, and your CMS is your payer, CMS will not pay for treatment of that wound.
And why is that?
That's their new rule. That's their rule, and that's it's supposed to penalize facilities for not performing well. You know, if you don't get any ulcers, they don't dock your pay for anything. But if you get one, they dock your pay.
So it's, I guess, if I understand you correctly, it's not the appropriate way to incentivize the programs that you're laying out.
No, I mean, well, my facility that I wrote the paper on, they were facing closure. They
Mm.
had major financial penalties because wounds that they had in their facility. So they were highly motivated to get rid of the wounds because, and they did great. They did great. In fact, we applied for a Codman Award, which is an award in nursing homes for special efforts and stuff. We didn't get it, but we almost got it. But
You made a good showing.
we made a good showing, yes.
Well, Dr. Tippett, because our audience is mostly comprised of family members of nursing home residents, can you kind of talk about what the typical granddaughter, daughter, son, um, nephew can do if they have a loved one in a nursing home to protect that
Well,
person from pressure ulcers?
they can, you know, keep their spirits up, visit them, keep them mobile as possible, you know. If they can walk, if they can go places, that would be great. Um, be generally supportive of them. Again, nursing homes typically are not dangerous places in terms of pressure ulcers compared to a hospital. All right. And if their loved one goes to the hospital, make sure that they're really looked at when they come back because that's when they're likely to have an injury that shows up. But, beyond that, try to keep their loved one as active as possible and as upbeat as possible. All those things will impact their care and impact their health.
I see. So just making sure that the resident is mobile to get that blood flowing, get their spirits up,
Yep.
that goes a
Mhm.
long way to preventing pressure ulcers. In
Absolutely.
in the last couple minutes, can you kind of talk about support mattresses, air mattresses? Because I mean, we've talked about how critical these things are. Can you talk about kind of what they are and how they work on the body and to prevent these things, for prevent pressure ulcers?
Okay. Well, the very in my book, the very best is a static air. It's just an air-filled cushion, if you will. It doesn't have power, so it's not dependent on the power cord, which some of them are. So if you have a bed that has to be plugged in, if your power goes out, your bed's not going to work. Okay. And so I like the one that doesn't depend on the power. And it causes the body to kind of float. And if you're floating, you're not going to have any pressure anywhere. Now, there are low air loss beds, and they blow air into the bed. They're considered pretty high level pressure support, but A, their power. You have to have them plugged in. B, you have to have them set right. And oftentimes they're not set right. And C, they're blowing air. A lot of people have infections like C. difficile and stuff like that. If you're blowing air, you're just blowing that into the air, and I really don't like that. So I'm not a fan of the low air loss mattresses, though you'll find those used very commonly, especially if someone has an ulcer. They think they need a low air loss mattress, but I would advise try to avoid that if possible. A gel pad does not provide any pressure support, so don't be don't be misled thinking that a gel pad is going to help because it isn't. And foam is pretty standard, and it's not bad, but you still are going to have pressure through the foam, so it's not the highest level as opposed to like a static air is going to totally relieve the pressure, and that's what you want. So on the chair and on the bed. You need them on both.
I see. Um, so that makes perfect sense. And with regard to the I'm not using the right word, the moisturizer for the skin, or what
The
yeah, what can you talk about that a little bit more? Like, what is it,
well,
and how often do you
my
apply it?
you apply it every day. My favorite is Backwall. You can buy that over the counter. It was invented over 100 years ago for cow udders. Well, lo and behold, the farmers who used it noticed that their hands were really in good shape.
Hmm.
So every farm family always had back balm on their kitchen counter. And now it's common. Shania Twain uses it on her lips. I mean, people everywhere are using it because it's a lanolin based, really good moisturizer. But and it's inexpensive, $8 for a can, which lasts a long time.
Well,
But
if Shania
some
Twain is using it, it must be good because she looks like she's defying
there you
all
go. See,
aging at all. So
there you go. But a lot of facilities won't use it because they say, well, it's not FDA approved. And well, yeah, it's a cosmetic. It's not a medicine per se. But A&D ointment is approved, and it's similar to Bacmol. So A&D ointment is a good one. Plain oil is okay, like olive oil or something like that. It's fine. How families could help. They could bring a moisturizer like that in. and they could come in and put it all over their mom or dad or whoever, you know?
Okay. And I mean, like, I guess it would be important for the family to not necessarily get permission, but at least notify the nursing home so that way it could be placed into the care plan,
Sure.
that this is being done and not just
Yep.
willy-nilly go in and start. Because you might be, if there's already a pressure ulcer, you might be interfering with the healing of the wound if you're slapping olive oil on something. But if I
You
understand you,
probably wouldn't be, but yeah, but you
well,
might.
possibly if you're not washing your hands, these type of things.
Yep.
Yeah. So,
Right.
well, Dr. Tippett, this has been very educational. We really appreciate you coming on to the show to talk to us about these things. Some of these concepts are a little bit different than we normally hear on the show, so I appreciate your perspective
Oh,
on
well, thank you.
these things. You're very
Thank you.
welcome. So thank you so
I'm
much.
glad you asked about it.
Yeah, of
Okay.
course, of course. I mean, we have a lot of shows dedicated to pressure ulcers, and there's a lot of different point of views on their prevention and their treatment. So I want to have as much information on this show for everybody as possible, and not necessarily have it from one perspective. So
Well, good.
thank
Good,
you.
good, good. Well, you all stay healthy in this pandemic, okay?
We certainly will. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So Dr. Tippett has a lot of interesting perspectives on these things. And like I was mentioning to her, um, some of these things might be a little bit different than how other wound care doctors handle their residents or their patients. But a lot of interesting things. The main thing that I would like to stress is family involvement. Even though we didn't get to that till the end, I think family involvement is very important, and I agree with Dr. Tippett that you want to get to the best of your ability, get your loved one moving, get your loved one up and going if possible, even if they're not, even if they're um, immobile, like if they have paralysis of one side, work the other side. Um, do what you can with that from a physical standpoint. From a psychological standpoint, it's always good to get the spirits up. I feel like if you're right in your soul, if you're right in your mind, then your body will follow. So that's really great advice. And the great advice is support services are extremely important with regard to preventing pressure ulcers. Making sure that if your loved one is at a high risk, or if you happen to be your resident, if your loved one is at one of these places where everybody's treated as a high risk, then having the proper support services can go a long way to protecting your loved one. So on behalf of Dr. Tippett, we really appreciate you coming on the show. We really appreciate you watching the show. I mean, on behalf of Dr. Tippett. Anyway, we will, let's see, I think we have another pressure ulcer episode coming up. That might be the next one. I'm not quite sure, but we really appreciate you sticking around. Again, like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, and we appreciate you. And with that, we will see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to the Nursing Home Abuse Podcast. Nothing said in this podcast, either by the host or the guest, should be construed as legal advice, nor is intended to create an attorney-client relationship between the host or their guest and the listener. New episodes are available every Monday on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, or on your favorite podcast app, as well as on YouTube and our website, nursinghomeabusepodcast.com. Again, that's nursinghomeabusepodcast.com. See you next time.